Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have some sympathies for Robin Hood, but I am not from Sherwood Forest. Mr. Speaker, that was exciting to my NDP friends, I know, who maybe think of themselves as more the party of Robin Hood. But I gather that the House will provide opportunities for discussion of such matters in the near future. In the meantime, I want to raise a very important issue of international human rights, a subject on which we may even find some rare agreement with my friends in the corner. In the context of this motion, I want to say that we have the honour of recognizing the presence in Canada, and in particular here in Ottawa, of Mrs. Kara-Murza, the wife of Vladimir Kara-Murza. She is here advocating for the release of her husband and indeed to promote justice and human rights. Vladimir Kara-Murza is likely among the most well-known heroes inside of Russia, who joins others who are fearlessly standing for freedom and human rights. Mr. Kara-Murza is currently imprisoned. He has survived multiple assassination attempts. I salute Mr. Kara-Murza's courage, as well as Mrs. Kara-Murza for his work in magnifying these issues, and I join my voice to others in calling for Mr. Kara-Murza's release. Now, in the spirit of recognizing the courageous Russian opposition figures who are standing against the invasion of Ukraine and also standing against human rights abuses taking place inside of Russia, I am seeking the concurrence of the House to a motion that I moved at the Immigration Committee earlier this year. That was a motion to oppose the invasion of Ukraine launched by Russian President Vladimir Putin, to recognize the courageous Russian opposition and really the importance of recognizing that opposition in the larger context of what we are seeing in the world today, and also to have immigration measures put in place to provide support and assistance to these brave Russian human rights defenders. The motion that I put forward at the Immigration Committee and that I seek the concurrence of the House to is as follows. We condemn the continuing attack on Ukraine ordered by Russian President Vladimir Putin. We recognize that a growing proportion of the Russian people are bravely resisting and opposing this attack, and we call on the Government of Canada to develop measures to support Russian dissidents, human rights defenders, and conscientious objectors within the military who are seeking to urgently flee Russia, while ensuring, of course, that necessary security precautions are taken. So that is the fifth report of the Standing Committee on Immigration. It was adopted by the Immigration Committee on April the 4th. And of course, the context has significantly shifted since then and arguably made the role of the Russian opposition even more important as we see increasing human rights violations inside of Russia, as we see in response to defeats on the battlefield that Russia is facing, the continuing brutalization of the Russian people and of the Ukrainian people by the Russian regime, throwing untrained, unprepared conscripts at the front lines, simply, in a sense, trying to pile up corpses of their own people in hopes of, in a vain hope of stopping the Ukrainian advance. So we're seeing how this brutal regime has no regard for the lives of the Ukrainian people. It also has no regard for the lives of the Russian people. And estimates are now that more people have sought to flee Russia than were actually involved in the invasion. Quite a number, quite a magnitude, and we're seeing the rallies, the acts of resistance by people in Russia that are trying to call out what the regime is doing, who are defending the rights of Ukrainians and who are also defending their own rights to choose and shape their own future. Now, I will have more to say about the Russian opposition, but let me just start here by making a few comments about, in particular, in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the things that Canada needs to do right away to defend, to support Ukraine. Ukraine is winning, Ukraine is succeeding, but they need continuing support from Canada and other Western allies. And I would say primarily we need to think in two areas, in the area of weapons support and in the area of energy security. In the area of weapons support, we've had various voices from Ukraine, including very forthright comments on the weekend from a Ukrainian member of parliament saying Canada needs to do more in terms of supplying weapons. And there seems to be a hesitation in terms of supplying vitally required weapons from Canada. Canada is falling behind in terms of support for Ukraine. More is required in terms of supplying weapons, and we in the official opposition will continue to push the government to give Ukraine all of the weapons supplies it needs. There have been other voices connecting to the government that have called on them to do more. Canada's own ambassador, Bob Rae, to the United Nations has called out the government and said, in his view, that the government needs to be doing all that is required to supply Ukraine with the weapons that it needs. So more engagement from this government in terms of supplying weapons. We were late to the party on that in many respects. We should have been supplying lethal weapons to Ukraine prior to the invasion. We should be doing more now. So in the area of weapons, also in the area of energy security. Right away after the invasion, Conservatives had a motion in this House that was recognizing the critical role of energy security in this conflict, saying that Canada needed to seize the moment to correct what have been 7 years of failed energy policy, to ramp up our energy exports to Europe, to supply Europe with the energy support and security it requires. And we recognize the failures in terms of developing the energy sector from the government over the last 7 years, but now would have been the time to recognize those failures of policy and to correct them. And yet the government is continuing to undermine efforts to expand energy development and export in response to these circumstances. And this is critical, Madam Speaker, because most of the world's democracies, as it happens, are geographically small and more populous nations that therefore tend to rely more on imports of natural resources, especially energy resources from other countries. Canada is relatively unique in the democratic world as being a geographically large, less densely populated country, rich in natural resources. And I believe that gives us a special vocation within the community of democratic nations. We have a responsibility to supply like-minded democratic allies with the kinds of energy resources that they require in order to have that security. And we should step up and fulfill that role. Because if we aren't supplying energy, providing that security, then our partners in Europe, but also in the Asia-Pacific, other democratic countries, will find themselves forced to be more reliant on more hostile, undemocratic sources of those energy resources. And we've seen how failures in Canadian energy policy to support our allies have left those allies more dependent on hostile powers like Russia, and therefore potentially more vulnerable to energy blackmail. Now, we can't reverse these 7 years of policy failures overnight, but the first step should be to recognize the problem. I note the Deputy Prime Minister has made comments about the need to get serious about this issue, and I would hope she would be even more explicit about acknowledging that her government has failed on these issues, and the current circumstances underline the need to correct that failure as quickly as possible. So when it comes to supporting Ukraine in general, Canada needs to step up in the area of weapons, and Canada needs to step up in the area of energy. But in particular, we also can step up as it relates to this motion. We can step up in our support of the Russian opposition, recognizing the critical role that they are playing and that they are going to play. Now, Madam Speaker, in some ways, it's difficult to know all of the dynamics that are going on inside of Russia. We can speculate about what may be happening, what may be being contemplated, what different figures that are opposed to the regime in Russia are doing. We can speculate about those things, but I think we can also learn the lessons of history and draw from those lessons in our understanding of what might be going on and the critical role that other countries can play in offering that support. As I've told the House before, my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, and I've done a lot of reading about the kind of anti-Nazi German resistance that was in place really throughout the Nazi era, but especially towards the end of the Second World War, that culminated in but continued after the Valkyrie plot. And I think there are a lot of lessons we can learn for understanding the kind of resistance that it can exist to authoritarian or totalitarian regimes and how it manifests itself. And I would just commend a few books to the consideration of honorable members on that era. I recently read Disobeying Hitler, German Resistance After Operation Valkyrie by Randall Hansen. And what he describes is the multifaceted nature of resistance that can take place in a totalitarian system. Sometimes you have people that are speaking out or protesting, and we've seen some of that in Russia. You have forms of military resistance seeking political change. But you also, and Hansen speaks in particular about this in his book, about how disobedience is a form of resistance. When you have a totalitarian regime giving orders to the military, you can then have sometimes instances where those orders are ignored or massaged to try to minimize the destruction, minimize the loss of life. And he chronicles many examples of this at the end of the Second World War, where low-level forms of resistance or disobedience by people within the German army, disobeying orders that had come from high command, preserved infrastructure, preserved lives, and had some degree of positive effect. So we can hope that what we will see more of going forward inside of Russia is this kind of multi-dimensional resistance, where you have people that are in the military that are maybe ordered to engage in atrocities or to respond in particular ways, who are ignoring, massaging those orders, maybe who are surrendering without authorization, who are taking these kinds of simple steps to try to resist the oppression of the Russian regime and its violence towards Ukraine, but also towards its own people. I think the other thing that I certainly found interesting about reading stories of the anti-Nazi German resistors is that many of them were motivated by a deep sense of nationalism. That is, they loved their country, they were committed to the honor and dignity of their country, and they felt that their country was being betrayed by the regime. These figures that were key in the German resistance, people like Admiral Canaris, they had this sense of loving their country more than their government did. And they also came from elite circles. Many of them were in positions where they were positions of privilege and power within the system that gave them the means to resist. And that existed alongside everyday people that were protesting in the streets in select moments, that were maybe distributing materials that were critical of the regime. And these things. In the case of the anti-Nazi German resistance, they didn't fulfill their full potential, but they had an impact. They led to lives being saved, but they also, I think, provided the moral basis for what came next. They did manage to show the world that there was an other Germany, a different Germany that wasn't represented by the fascist regime. And I think we see a similar thing happening in Russia, where people like Vladimir Kara-Murza, their heroism, their resistance, their sacrifice, and that of many others, it shows the fact that there is a different Russia. There is a Russia represented by people who believe in freedom and democracy, but also who deeply love their country, who love their culture, and who don't buy into this fiction that somehow there's an inevitable antagonism between Russia and the West, that they recognize that values of freedom and democracy, recognition of universal human dignity, that these things are universal, and they want to see Russia have a government that embraces these ideas and principles. So we can recognize the value of the Russian opposition, the role it is playing, and the role that it must continue to play. So in particular then, what are we seeing right now? Because this motion, it was proposed on April, it was tabled in the House on April the 4th. We note, of course, that, as I said, there are many things that we can't know about what may be going on inside of Russia, but we do see evidence, and we've heard evidence at the Foreign Affairs Committee and elsewhere that there are emerging cracks. There's been speculation about, for instance, would the military carry out an order in Russia to use a nuclear weapon in light of the devastating consequences that would no doubt have for Russia? Would such an order be the occasion for resistance? We can certainly hope that it would be. We can see how, in the face of Russia's further mobilization, drafting people that are outside of military age, people that are in some cases physically not fit for military service, drafting those people and forcing them towards the front line without anything resembling appropriate training. That this is rightly provoking a sense of resistance and frustration within Russia, that we have people protesting, people fleeing, and I think it's just really important for us to recognize in the context of this conflict that everybody involved is an individual. The people are responsible for their own choices and their own actions. There are, of course, there's the regime itself. There are many people around it that are responsible for the evil actions that they are undertaking. And there are also people that are Russian who are opposed to that. We need to then reflect on that and do all we can to support the Russian opposition. So Canada's engagement in response to the invasion of Ukraine, we need to be doing more in terms of weapons, in terms of energy policy, but also in terms of supporting the opposition. Now, this motion on April 4th, as I said, it was presented prior to that order for mobilization, and we're seeing all the more now in response to the resistance, the need for Canada to respond, and other countries to respond in offering that support. Now, I want to mention as well that this motion, of course, speaks to immigration measures. It comes to us from the Immigration Committee. It talks about offering channels of support in terms of immigration for Russian dissidents, human rights defenders who are fleeing. And for years, Conservatives have been advocating special supports in terms of immigration for human rights defenders. We've talked about it in the context of special programs for Hong Kong and other situations. And our contention in general is that those who have taken a stand, who have fought for human rights and are, as a result of it, facing severe threats and persecution, that those people make great Canadians, that they can richly contribute to our country in terms of our understanding and appreciation for the values of freedom and democracy, and that we can provide those people with an opportunity to be safe here and a platform to continue their work and their advocacy. So this is one of the concrete measures that we're taking, and I know there's some controversy in other countries about the question of the number of people that are fleeing Russia and who should be able to come and so forth. I think it's important to underline that this motion speaks specifically to human rights defenders. It speaks specifically to those who wish to flee, who have been actively engaged in human rights work, who are active dissidents, who are active and clear as conscientious objectors. So this is the focus of the motion, and I think on that basis it should enjoy broad-based support in this House. And I hope members will be prepared to add their voice to this important motion, and that we'll be able to get this motion supported, voted on, adopted by all members. I think this House standing together to express its support for the Russian opposition, to express its recognition that the Putin regime does not represent the Russian people, and to recognize those brave Russians. Many may have private objections, but certainly to recognize those that have been vocal and public in opposing the regime in various ways. I think it would send a powerful signal if the Canadian House of Commons said, recognizing as part of this that we support the Ukrainian people in their resistance to Putin's tyranny, and we support the Russian people in their resistance to Putin's tyranny. I should say also the Belarusian people in their efforts to resist Putin's tyranny and other peoples that are affected by the violence of that regime. So this House of Commons, this government can and should do more, supplying weapons, energy security, and supporting the Russian opposition. I hope that we're able to send that strong message today in support for the people of Ukraine and the people of Russia. Thank you.